Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us this evening for the session hosted by the Clearwater and District Chamber of Commerce. This is the first of many information sessions that we plan on providing to our membership. We begin by acknowledging that we recognize and honor the people of the Shymco First Nation on whose traditional unceded lands that we live, work, and play, and who have been caretakers of this land since time immemorial. I'm very pleased, and the Chamber of Commerce Board of Directors is pleased to introduce Tracy Shymco. She's the Deputy Assessor for BC Assessment this Tuesday, January the 24th, 2023. Tracy has been with the BC Assessment for 16 years. She has been an acting assessor for the Thompson Okanagan for the last 2 years. Throughout her tenure at BC Assessment, she has focused primarily on market valuation portfolios. She works closely with taxing jurisdictions throughout the region as a point of contact for assessment information. She also leads teams through assessment years where her team is focused on providing the most accurate assessment information to property owners, municipal clients, and inform our Ministry of Disaster Impacts. After Tracy's presentation, we will have a Q&A session for viewers to ask questions. You can do this one of 4 ways. Either enter your question in the chat box, which should be at the bottom of your screen. Second, you can raise your hand, which is the reaction at the bottom of your screen. There will be a little hand that you would put up. So you'd raise your hand like such. If you have a specific question to your individual property, you can send an email to, hang on you guys while I let people in, info@clearwaterbcchamber.com, and we will send your question on to the correct contact. And for the people that are present in the room, which we have 5 or 6 of us, you can ask the question.
About 1,500 survivors went to the
When question and answer time does come after the presentation, please use appropriate language and be respectful with your tone. Please ask one question at a time to ensure that you get the answer you're looking for. If asking your question via the chat box, the chat function is on the screen, as I've explained already. Again, use the raised hand if you want to ask your question online. And if you are on a landline or a cell phone, please remember to press *6 to mute yourself and to unmute yourself if you want to ask a question. Also, BC Assessment has some very good videos for reference in understanding the information presented here this evening. We will have links posted on our Facebook page in the coming days. Thank you, and now I'll hand it over to Tracy.
Hi, thank you very much for having me. Again, my name is Tracy Shymco. I am the acting assessor for the Thompson Okanagan region, and I would just like to recognize that I'm giving this presentation today from the Shwepek Nation. I'm honored to be on their traditional territories. So today I will be talking to you about BC assessment, a little bit about valuation, our classification and exemption rules, assessment cycles and key dates, the relationship between assessment and taxes, a 2023 overview both provincially and for Clearwater, the appeal process, and collaborating with BC Assessment. So who are we? BC Assessment was established in 1974 under the Assessment Authority Act. This was in response to having a fair provincial assessment authority that was not related to municipal taxing authorities. We were a Crown corporation. We're independent from any taxing authority, and we value all real estate on an annual basis. And we provide an annual assessment roll with the exception of 2008 to 2009, where we did a hybrid roll, but that was unusual. And we are providing value for the foundation to provide local governments and taxing authorities finances to support communities through property tax revenue. We serve all British Columbians, so that's property owners who own residential, non-residential, market and non-market properties, local governments, Indigenous nations, and the provincial government under the Ministry of Finance and Honorable Katrina Conroy. We serve British Columbia through our vision, which is to provide dynamic and reliable assessments and to support strong, vibrant communities across British Columbia. Our mission is to provide uniform assessments and have trusted property information. And we function with values that we are here for each other, we own our own experience, we're one team, and we're dedicated learners. Again, the assessment role is an annual role. This provides stable, predictable basis for real estate property taxation in British Columbia. It represents 2.16 million properties across the province with a total value of $2.72 trillion. BC Assessment identifies the ownership, the value, the classification, and the exemptions of each property in British Columbia. We provide a stable tax base for local governments and taxing authorities to raise billions of dollars annually in property taxes for schools and local services such as police. How we value properties, we have three distinct categories. We have residential, industrial, commercial industrial, and legislative. For residential and our IC&I, industrial, commercial, and investment properties, those are done on market value. And it is a July 1st valuation date. That's a legislated date that we follow. And we have a physical condition and permitted use date of October 31st of each year. Market value considers present use, location, physical factors, building costs, revenue of rental, selling price of land and improvements, and of comparable land and improvements. Legislative values use prescribed rates and cost manuals to set things for major industry, long skinny things like railways, pipelines, managed forest, farm, electrical, and that sort of thing. The foundation of market value is highest and best use. So this is the most reasonable probable price that a property would sell for, which is physically possible, legally permissible, financially feasible, and maximally productive. So local governments really influence the highest and best use of a property. So a local government will set an OCP that could then influence the rezoning of a property. And then that property would be redeveloped. And then there would be market demand. And then the assessment would go up. We classify properties using 9 property classes. These are all prescribed property classes that we follow. So class 1 is residential, which is the biggest property class, followed by 6, which is business and other, and then light industry, and then we have our recreation nonprofit, farm, managed forest, major industry, utilities, and then supportive housing. Exemptions are applied each year to properties based on 2 sections in the community charter. 220 of the community charter are for statutory exemptions. Those are exemptions that BC Assessment applies based on the rules within the legislation. And then permissive exemptions, which municipalities, property owners apply to municipalities. And if they comply with 224 of the community charter, all or a portion of their taxes could be exempt. Our assessment cycle is very predictable. So between January 1st and January 31st, we have inquiry period. That's what we're going through right now, where property owners are asked through media and through their assessment notice to call BC Assessment if they have questions about their assessment. It's also the time where you can appeal your assessment. So January 31st is the deadline to appeal your assessment. And that's if you disagree with what an appraiser has said about the value of your property. And then you can go in front of a park panel, which occurs between February and March 15th. And that you'll present your information, BC Assessment will present theirs, and the panel will decide. And this allows us to, any changes to the completed roll will then allow us to produce a revised roll to reflect any of those changes through that first level of appeal. April 1st to the September 30th is when we're doing all of our assessment projects. So we're collecting new construction, we're doing reassessments, and we also have PAB, which is the Property Assessment Appeal Board. And the deadline to appeal PAB is April 30th, and that's that second level of appeal. And the other thing that happens during this time is we reach our valuation date, which is July 1st of each year. October 1st to December 31st is our roll production time. So that's when we're looking at properties for their physical condition and permitted use. That's also the deadline for exemption. So exemption bylaws have to be submitted to BC assessment by October 31st. And then our completed roll reflects ownership at LTSA as of November 30th. And December 31st, we mail our assessment notices. The relationship between assessment and taxation is your assessed value times the property tax rate, divided by 1,000 is the property taxes that are due. Typically, when people see their assessment and they see that they have a 30 or 40% increase, they go, oh my gosh, my taxes are going to go up 30 or 40%. And that's not necessarily the case. What essentially happens is the average tax, the average increase for a property class is then the tax rate is stabilized to that. So if you are above the average, then you typically will see an increase in your taxes. And if you're below the average, you might see a decrease in your taxes. And if you're around the average, you'll probably see very little change in your taxes. So the assessment roll overview. So provincially, we had a 12% increase in total value to $2.72 trillion on the roll. We had a decrease in the total amount of non-market change that was added to the roll at $33.52 billion worth of new construction. And 77% of the 2.72 trillion are residential properties, so that class 1 property type. There are 2.16 million properties, which is a 1% increase from the 2022 roll. For Clearwater, we had a 24% increase from 2022 on the total roll value at $692 million. We had a 48% increase in the non-market change collected, or the new construction. So we added $10 million of new construction to the roll. And your roll, 78% of your roll represents residential properties. And there was no change to the number of folios in Clearwater, and there's 1,424 folios. This is the average increase. So for residential single family, the average increase was between 15 and 30%. Residential strata was between 30 and 45%, and commercial and industrial was between 5 and 20%. The appeal process. So as I mentioned before, January 31st is the deadline to appeal. And we're currently in what we call inquiry period, where you can call BC Assessment or submit a request for information online. And then January 31st is that deadline for the first level of appeal. And between February 2nd and March 15th, that's when those hearings are heard. So the Property Assessment Review Panel are members appointed by the government. They're not related to BC Assessment. And it's all phone-in appointment. So it's quite easy, and you can be heard through the Property Assessment Review Panel. And after the Property Assessment Review Panel, if you're not satisfied with the decision, there is a second level of appeal called the Property Assessment Appeal Board. If you do go to the second level appeal, there is a fee involved. It's $30 for residential and commercial properties to appeal to that second level. The completed roll, so roll acceptance. So this means the percentage of properties that didn't appeal their property. So as you can see, the light blue line is provincial, and it's pretty stable at 98%. So we typically have a 2% appeal ratio. And then for the city of Kamloops, this is the middle blue line. And they're usually anywhere between 2 and 3% for appeal. And the dark blue line is Clearwater. So we didn't have very much very many appeals in 2021, which was unusual because after the first year of COVID, that was quite a slow year for appeals. And then we had a much higher acceptance in 2021 for Clearwater. And then 2022 was again just around that 1%. And we're just going to the end of inquiry, so we should know what our appeals look like in another 2 weeks for the 2023 roll. Oops. The change to the completed to the revised roll. So as I mentioned before, when you appeal your assessment, property values can change. And what you'll do is you'll get this revised assessment roll. And so that's when we produce our revised roll for municipalities to base their taxes on. So the change between the completed and the revised roll is important for municipalities for financial planning. So we don't want to see a massive shift between values there. And as you can see, Clearwater again is that dark blue line. So typically we're below like negative 0.2% of a change in the completed roll to the revised roll. Provincially, we hover around that negative 0.3 to 0.2 range. Resources. So BC Assessment has an excellent website. There's an assessment search by address. You can type in any address in the province. This will allow you to compare properties on your street, in your neighborhood. You can look at sold properties, and it gives you a good idea of how valuation is throughout the province. We also have a property information and trends page, which gives you an overview of how different areas in the province are moving. We have interactive maps where you can hover over and see percentage increases of different types of properties. And we also have services for government and Indigenous relations. There are also additional resources through gov.bc.ca, and that's the Property Assessment Review Panel. So that will give you an idea of how the appeal process works from the ministry's perspective and how you upload data. There's the PAB, the Property Assessment Appeal Board. So that website, you can see previous PAB cases, and you can go through the appeal, see how that second level of appeal works. We also have links to the homeowners grant and the property tax deferral program. Any questions? I'll stop sharing so I can see the chat.
So far, we have one question in the chat, which is, are appeals applied only to the appellant? If a large number of people in an area appeal, does that or can that trigger an overall review of that area?
So it depends. If a large number of it depends what the appeal reason is. So if we see a trend in the group of appeals, so let's say it's all a certain age category of homes that's appealed in a certain area, it would cause us to do a reassessment of that property type, but probably not until the appeal process is over. So it wouldn't reflect the change to the overall community wouldn't happen until the next roll year. Does that make sense?
Does that help you, Peter? Does anybody from that's called in have questions?
Yes, thank you, by the way.
Okay, thank you. Anybody at the table here have questions? One of the things that I think would be helpful to the group would be if you could explain what properties can be exempted from property taxes.
Sure. So the community charter, 224 of the community charter, gives us direction on what properties the municipality can exempt from taxes. Typically, there is a process for permissive exemptions, or what they're called, and the majority are nonprofit or churches that are for the surrounding church area. And you would have to apply to the municipality. The municipality will look to make sure that it complies with the community charter, and then they would send a bylaw to us, and we would exempt either all or a portion of that property. So that's for the permissive exemptions. For statutory exemptions, they're typically things like public schools, churches, playing fields, municipal properties, going off the top of my head, but those kind of things would be statutorily exempt. So if we see that it is owned by that group, then we go to section 220 of the community charter and we'll apply the correct statutory exemption code to ensure that the local government sees that, or the municipality sees that that's why it's not being taxed for all or part of the taxes. So for permissive exemptions, they are exempted from the municipal portion of taxes, but they still pay the school taxes.
We were chatting earlier before people signed on, so I'm gonna ask the question just so that you could sort of go into the reasons Clearwater has changed a bit. So
Yes.
I personally have saw an increase in my property assessments from 2020 of 72% to 2023, so the assessment that just came out.
Yeah, so communities like Clearwater, that's not uncommon. Actually, even Kamloops, that's not uncommon. The areas where houses have remained, and I'm going to say this loosely, relatively affordable, have still maintained good value and have seen increases over that time. And through the pandemic, we've seen many people who have had the ability to work remotely. And so they are able to move to communities that have sort of been forgotten gems. I think Clearwater is one of them. One of those beautiful outdoor recreation places where it's still affordable to buy a home. And if people can live and work in those communities remotely, then the real estate has definitely seen increases in those places.
Doug Borrow, you have your hand up? Question?
I own several properties in Clearwater, and I'm just wondering if you can tell me why all of them they increase by a different percentage.
Sure.
Like, you don't physically go through 2.1 million properties and evaluate each one of them.
No.
But how do you determine how much each one goes up?
Sure. So for single family dwellings, they are grouped based on age, quality. So we look at the quality and age of a property, and then we group those together. So if you have an older home, it will be grouped with older homes. And we put them in the system using a inventory base. So we have the square footage, the number of bathrooms, the roof cover, the type of heating, and the square footage, and that goes. And if there's basement finish or no basement finish, that all goes into our system, and then it gets given a quality code and the year built. And then if you've done any renovations, we also track effective age, which is the difference between when your house was built. Those renovations make your house the useful life longer. So we have this thing called the effective age. So all of the properties are in the system that way. And so we typically then look to sales that fall within those categories. And so they might move slightly different. So you might have newer homes that are selling at 25% more than what they did last year, and older homes, because they're still that just slightly lower in value, they're selling for 35% more than what they were last year. So there's still a difference between the two, but because of market influences, they might change slightly different.
So do you pay attention to municipal governments when they amend their official community plan or the rezoning bylaw?
Yes. So our zoning gets updated every time there is an amendment to a zoning bylaw. We change that, and then we look to the market to see if that influences the value. So if something goes from, say, residential to commercial, that might change the value of that property because commercial might be trading for more, or in some cases less for a little bit, and then over time it will go more. So official community plans give us direction on where certain areas are going to be transitioning. So you might have areas that transition from say rural to industrial or something like that. So we watch that to see where the values go.
To elaborate on that, are you able to talk about the ICI valuation or how that happens with industrial, commercial, and institutional a little bit?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that happen with ICI, so commercial properties. The bulk of commercial properties are done on income. So what that means is we look at the rental rates that a commercial property would rent for, and then we capitalize it based on similar properties that have sold. So it's basically the number of years for the return. So that's how a typical commercial property, so a storefront or an office building, would be done on rental rates and then capitalized. We do account for expenses and vacancy, and those are fairly stable over time. And then for most industrial properties that are fairly large in nature, those would be done on the cost approach. And the cost approach is really looking at a replacement cost new less depreciation. And then the land value is done as if the land were vacant. So, and those two things are added together to give the overall value. And then legislated value, or things that are like pipelines or railways or farmland, those are all legislated rates. So we have manuals that prescribe what rate we can use based on the type of use it is. So for example, farmland, if it's grazing or hay fields, those are at different rates. And so we would apply those different rates based on the number of acres you have in each of those things.
Another question that I've heard out in the community is a person, is claiming that their assessed value went up significantly, like 80-90%. Is that likely due to the fact that maybe BC Assessment was able to do a Google map view or something like that and see that they had buildings that weren't?
Yeah, so we do reassessments, and we use technology to do those reassessments in many cases, what we call desktop review, which allows us to hire aerial imagery and oblique imagery that allows us to look at properties in different ways. And so we may find garages or outbuildings that we didn't have assessed, and that could be one of the reasons. So that would be part of that new construction or non-market change. So if you have something that was added to your property that was inventory that we didn't have, that could cause a dramatic increase to your assessment. And it might not be that you built it this year, it was just that BC Assessment didn't have it. And so that's why that change happened.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
For my assessment here, for 2020 and 21, but those two combined, it went up 6% and 2%, so 8% over those 2 years. And then for 22 and 23, it's gone up 30 and 41%. So that's 71% compared to 8% over the previous 2 years. So why such a big jump in the last 2 years?
That's what the market is telling us. So we are a market-based assessment approach. So we look to sales of similar properties, and how those are moving in the market is how your assessment moves in the assessment cycle.
Just based on the sales in the area recently?
Yeah.
Okay. And if it's assessed more than what I can sell it for, that I should do the appeal process?
Yeah. So if it's assessed for more than what you can sell it for today, maybe not. So July 1st is our legislated date. So that's a non-negotiable date where we use to set the roll values. So as of July 1st, if you think that you could have gotten that for your property, then I would say there's no need to appeal. But if you think it's high for a July 1st valuation date, then yes, you should appeal your assessment.
Yeah, it is high for July 1st as well, because I was looking at selling it back then, so it's like $90,000 over, right? So
right.
That's I don't know whether I understand you were saying sometimes if it's over, it doesn't really affect your taxes that much. So I'm kind of curious on that kind of overage. Is it worthwhile to?
Well, it is. So it depends on the residential tax, or not residential, the class 1 tax rate. So whatever the average tax rate for class 1 is, that's where the tax rate will be balanced to. And then anything that is above that average you'll likely see an increase in your taxes. It certainly won't be a 40% increase, but it might be a 10% increase or something like that. And then if you're below that average for that class, then you'll likely see a decrease in your taxes. And if you're around the same as the average, then you likely won't see any change in your taxes. So that's how that works. So it really depends on what the average for the residential class is. And I don't have that offhand for Clearwater right now, but I believe it's around 30%.
Okay. Doug, do you have another question?
Yeah, so if I disagreed with, say, one of my evaluation or BC assessments value of one of my properties, and I had a certified credible appraiser come in and appraise my property, would you have to agree with their evaluation?
No, so we don't have to agree to it. So there's a number of reasons you might hire an appraiser. So if you're looking for financing or an estate sale or whatever, we'll look at it and we will consider it. But we do also look to sales. So there, and really it depends on where the value comes in with that private appraisal. So if it's within a reasonable range of say 5% of the assessment, we might say, you know what, we are actually quite close. These two assessments are, or the appraisal versus the assessment is very close in value.
But a proper appraiser, they do evaluate sales history as well.
For sure, yeah. The other thing we would look to is also the date. So if you had an appraiser come in and give you a valuation for July 1st, then that is the same as our valuation date. So we would definitely, like, I'm not saying we wouldn't consider it. I'm just saying it might not be all that we consider.
So if it did come in lower and then I appealed it with my appraisal,
yeah,
I guaranteed it's going to kind of stay there. Like say if market values, I've done the appeal process and then they've agreed that it was overassessed, but the next year it went right back up to what it was the previous year. So would that be a waste of time and money? Because if say I had it appraised and it brought it down and then you adjusted it, the next year, would I have to have a brand new appraisal done?
What each year
if
is
sales were comparable?
Yeah, so each year is a separate roll year. So that's where that annual roll comes in. So each year we're looking to the market and saying, this is the inventory we have for this property, and these are the market comparables, and this is the assessment. So that happens every year, and we don't consider previous years. So the change in value to year is not what we're looking to. We're looking to the inventory of your property and what current properties are selling for and putting the value on that. So that's that annual assessment cycle.
Okay, we have
and there are reasons for that. So I will, one of the biggest reasons for an annual assessment cycle is that it does provide a lot of stability to municipalities. So if there were a multi-year appeal process, so PAB is one of those things where it can, in some cases, extend beyond 1 year. And it provides a lot of risk to municipalities in terms of knowing how much they have for budget.
Does that help? There is a question in the chat.
Oh, sure.
Are assessments going down next year to match the slowdown in the real estate market?
That's likely. We will do that analysis in, so through April to September next year, we look at what the market's doing, and then we set the rolls in October. So we're really always looking to that July 1st date. The way they're trending right now, that looks to be the case, but I'm not sure once we see the full July to July cycle.
Do you ever have appeals where people come in and say that their property is worth more than what you've assessed it for?
We do. That actually surprisingly is not that uncommon. And we follow the same appeal process as we would for somebody that says their value's too high. So we go over the inventory, we look at the sales, and we make a call whether the property owner is right or not. And if we disagree, then we advise them to appeal, and then they can present to the park panel what they think the value is, and we'll present ours, and then the panel can decide where the value should sit.
So I think I know the answer to this, but I'll ask it just in case other people might be thinking it. So if the assessed values go down quite a bit next year, say 29%,
yeah.
How does that affect the municipal taxation?
So it's that same formula where whatever that property class average changes, the tax rate is adjusted to make it so that average doesn't really change that much. So what ends up happening is, like, if you have, say, for ease, if you have a budget of $1 million and you have this year, and you have a budget of $1 million next year, and you have 10 properties this year and next year, but the value goes from 100,000 to 80,000, that tax rate changes to adjust for that same budget amount. So just because the value is lower doesn't, and it just the mill rate then just becomes higher, but the overall budget is the same, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, you explained it well, thanks. Do we have any more questions?
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
So with Trans Mountain going through people's properties now and doubling the width of the area now that they're taking up with pipeline because they're doubling it or dualing it, and that makes some of your land less usable because they have rights there, a lease through that. Does that in any way affect your tax or your assessments?
It depends. So it could affect your land value depending on how much usable space it occupies and where it goes through your property. So if it deems a good portion of your property unusable, likely it might impact your value.
Okay.
so how do you assess, just for people on the call here, how does so pipeline, how does that get assessed for property taxes?
So that's one of those long skinny things. So it is a utility. We work closely with Trans Mountain Pipeline to get costs. So they provide us with the cost of the pipeline and how much length of the pipeline that it is. And then it's typically a linear rate for pipelines. And that's utility class, so class 2.
Okay.
And so typically for a utility or a long skinny thing, there's one folio, but it extends a long ways. So it could bypass a number of other properties, but it's one long thing that goes through.
So when would the revenue from the widened Trans Mountain pipeline, when would that revenue come into the municipal government?
It's already coming into the municipal government. So part finished structures are assessed and taxed. So as they complete, we add more to the roll. So the municipality is seeing non-market change for the Trans Mountain progress.
As I say, with the widening of the Trans Mountain, did they not already own that land? So that would be part of your taxes?
Typically for long skinny things, it's improvements. So the actual pipe is assessed.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Good question.
Huh?
Yeah. Are there any other questions? Anybody? Oh, Mr. Borer, you have your hand up again? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think you kind of answered it, but maybe I don't understand it. So you say the property values in Clearwater are 6.9 million. So you're saying that the district of Clearwater would know what the values of property are every year they get notice of those values. Is that correct?
I'm not sure I follow the question. Can you repeat it?
So for taxation, they're going to change their mill rate. So say the property values are $692 million, and then they set their mill rate at so much, so they need so much taxation.
Yeah.
They're notified of what the values coming out, say for 2022 are. Like the district would get those values every year?
Every year they get a completed roll. So the completed roll are all of the properties in Clearwater for all of the different property classes. So that comes out, that gets released to them December 31st. So they then can start their budgeting. So they can look to see what they, maybe you need a new fire truck, or you have some capital expenditures like road repairs and things like that that have been delaying over time. So they can then look to where they look at their non-market change as well. So any new construction, which is added value to the roll outside of market movement. And then they consider all of those things, and then they adjust their tax rates accordingly based on the budget needs and where their revenues are. And then the other thing is that roll stability. So the difference between the completed roll and the revised roll. So that's really important for municipalities for that to be fairly stable. Because if they're planning their budgets on a completed roll and then the revised roll changes dramatically, that's not good, because now they've got they need to adjust that mill rate again. So that's where that difference between the completed and revised roll is an important factor as well. So through the appeal period, if we have busy appeal years, then we let the municipalities know, yes, this is a busy appeal year, you should expect some risk of loss.
So is that value public information, or is that just given to, say, the municipality?
The completed roll is public information.
Okay.
But the details of like each property aren't. So we fall under the Freedom of Information and Privacy Act. So the completed roll, or the face of the roll, is public knowledge. So you can go through, all of the properties, but you don't see the owners or that kind of thing because that's private information. But you can see roll totals, that kind of stuff. So, and this would be an onerous and awful process, but if you used assessment search, you can search pretty much every property in Clearwater and see what they're valued at.
Yeah, no, I was just wondering if there was a grand total instead of doing that with my calculator.
Yeah.
What the taxation was for just Clearwater area, so that I knew what to expect.
Yeah, so the municipality gets the completed roll with all the totals, and that's for the municipality. So we provide that service to the municipality, but it is face of the roll information. We would never provide the completed roll, to a single person, if that makes sense. The municipality would have to release that information to you.
But it is public knowledge, correct?
Yeah, all of the values on it are public, yes.
So as part of this conversation, I have reached out to Linda Claassen, the Director of Finance for the District of Clearwater, and asked if she could do a presentation to the members of the Chamber of Commerce on the 5-year financial plan, so that we could understand where the council's going with the budget for 2023. Likely council wouldn't have set any kind of a rate right now. They probably have something in their mind, but I don't think they would be that far along. So she's thinking she was gonna have a conversation first with council. So it'd be later in February if she was going to do a presentation. Because then it would link this all together. It would have been nice to have the two of you together.
Yeah.
We were actually hoping to have Trans Mountain this evening, but Jasmine had her baby, so they were unable to give us an update tonight.
And there is another question in the chat about the Trans Mountain pipeline and negotiated reserve land. So it depends how you've negotiated with Trans Mountain. So if there is an easement that is filed with LTSA, or Land Title and Survey Authority, then BC Assessment would get a copy of that easement or right of way. And then we would look to your property and see how it impacts value and make a decision on whether there is a significant value difference or not. So that's how that would work. Now, if it's just negotiated between you and Trans Mountain and nothing is registered on your title, then likely BC Assessment wouldn't know about it.
So for people that just want to know what the question was, would BC Assessment be aware of the changes to the pipeline reserve for each property? Or is your exclusion, or if your exclusion got bigger, would you have to contact BC Assessment to revisit it? In my case, the pipeline runs more or less under the existing one because they tunneled under. Trans Mountain did renegotiate the reserve with us. It got larger, wider by a couple of feet. So that was the question.
And so in that answer, BC Assessment gets all of land changes through Land Titles and Survey Authority. So anything that gets registered on your title, we would get a copy of and then make adjustments accordingly. That's also our source of truth for size of properties. So we use Land Title and Survey Authority for the size of the source of truth for the size of properties as well.
So if that was going through now, that would probably change for next year's taxes probably, right?
Right, yeah. So if they just renegotiated with you today, then it won't be until 2024 that we would get a copy of that. Because again, November 30th is the last date, registration date at LTSA, that we put onto the completed roll. So for 2023 roll, anything that happened after November 30th that goes through land titles, with the exception of ownership changes up to December 31st, so November 30th, any subdivision plans that happen on December 3rd, that gets impacted on the next roll year.
And for new construction, is there a date in which you look, say September 30th, to get the valuation?
October 31st is our physical condition and permitted use. So if you're building a new structure, October 31st, we look to up to October 31st for where you're at. So if you're at, say, lockup, we would assess you at lockup as of October 31st.
So if I'm wondering on my property, it's gone up like 140%, and not one thing has been done to it since 2020. Now, the best way then to appeal is for me to find comparables as to what I think the value of it is, or do I find comparables as to what you are saying its value is and say it is not at that level?
So first go onto the BC assessment website and file the appeal. So there's an online appeal form. So you need to file that online appeal form first. And then to support your value, you would look to what properties you think are comparable to yours and why. And you would show the panel that and say, these are the homes that I think are more comparable to my home. And this is where I think the value would really be, not where it is. And then BC assessment would provide 3 sales and say, these are the sales that we're using to support value, and the panel decides where the value should be.
And that's bcassessment.ca?
Yeah, www.bcassessment.ca. And there's a section on the website that says appeals, and you click on that and it takes you to an online appeal form. And that way, so the Assessment Act requires that when you appeal a property, you have to submit your reason, your address, the roll number, that kind of thing, your name. So it has all of the things that you need in order to appeal.
I didn't spell it right, sorry. I'm trying to do it sideways. Upside down and sideways.
I was gonna say I have the 8-year-old boy in my head.
Thank you, Tracy. So is there any more questions for Tracy? Anybody online have any more questions? Anybody in the room have any more questions?
I'm good, that was very good, thank you very
Okay.
much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tracy. So on behalf of the Chamber of Commerce, we thank you very much for your time this evening, because I know it's nighttime. And we really appreciate the information you provided us, and it's been really good.
Well, thank you for having me. It was a pleasure to talk to you all. Have a great evening.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Bye.
So to the folks still on the line, if you haven't hung up, oops. I just want to let people know that coming soon is the draft strategic plan that was developed through a day-long session with the board of directors. Further, for a copy of this year's calendar for the Chamber of Commerce, check out our website or reach out to Dina Pidcock by emailing info@clearwaterbcchamber.com. Thank you. Anybody have any more questions on just general? Good session. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and there's more to come.
Thanks, Leslie and Dana, for making this happen.
Good night.
Yes, thank you. Very informative.
Good night.